Good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started shortly. This is Tracy again with BPM Plus Health. This is session number 2, authoring clinical workflows using BPM Plus standards. I'll just give it another minute or two as folks join, and then we'll get started. All right. Great. Mute a couple folks. There we go. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to session number 2, authoring clinical workflows using BPM Plus standards. Our use case today, managing COVID in the emergency department. And our guest speaker, Davide Sottara. He's co-chair of the authoring working group at BPM Plus Health and principal knowledge engineer at Mayo Clinic. And if you like, there's a chat box here in WebEx. You can enter questions throughout. Davide has a couple sections where he'll naturally pause to look, for questions. So feel free, and you can also, unmute at that time. But while he's speaking, we found if you could mute for a bit, that would be great, just to cut down on feedback. But Davide, let me turn this over to you. Thanks for presenting today.
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm still hearing a couple of beeps, so I think we should be ready to start in a minute. While we get people to come in, let me clarify. Of course, I have to. This presentation is on a personal basis, and I'll tell you in a moment who I'm working with and representing. So this is not a Mayo Clinic official presentation, nor am I acting right now as my role of authoring co-chair. So just clarifying that a lot of opinions will be debatable and questionable, and hopefully will trigger more conversations in our communities. But with that said, thank you, everybody. I'm honored to have this occasion to introduce the work that I've been doing with several groups. In fact, throughout my presentation today, I will start giving some credits, due credits, and then I'll show a little bit of the methodology I've been applying that resulted in the models, and then I'll spend the most prominent part to the presentation on actually looking at the models. So, starting here, of course, the very first credits should go to the people that created the tool. Some of you may be familiar with. It's a self-contained cognitive decision support tool that helps manage patients in the emergency department that may show up with COVID. The goal is to classify them quickly, and based on the classification, route them to the most appropriate care setting. This tool is evidence-based. It's the result of a summarization of a lot of literature, has been developed by ASEP in collaboration with Evidence Care. Dr. Brian Fengler is one of our subject matter experts, and is available in its text format at the links that I put in the presentation. As you can see, it's a fairly compact tool in the category of what we've been categorizing, for lack of better terms, as care process models and support tools. This work was also done in collaboration with and supported by the C19 digital guidelines working group, which is part of a broader initiative, a response team around COVID-19, community-based, cross-institution, in the open. It's all worked on pro bono to help us fight through these hard times. The working group specifically on the digital guidelines, the responsibility, the charge is to take the human readable facing artifacts like the tool I was showing a moment ago and translate that into something that's computable in some sense and so can be used to drive applications. Patient provider, well, in this case, provider facing specifically applications. So this C19 digital guidelines working group is what brought me in onto this problem. Of course, I had a BPM Plus background. And just to keep mentioning that working group also created a bridge with another initiative, companion initiative, the CPG on Fire initiative, which is another attempt at taking clinical knowledge, clinical guidelines, pathways, care process models, and translating them into, in this case, a full FAIR compliant implementation guide. My personal take is that, of course, two initiatives, I'm involved in both. There's value in both. There's a need, my perspective, to cooperate. There are really good engineering, clinical perspectives in both communities. We work with subject matter experts. BPM Plus brings to the table languages, tools, principles that are mature across industry. HL7 has the clinical impact, FAIR, of course, connection to the data. We need to work together. And what I'm going to show today is mostly focused on BPM Plus. This is our community, but has hooks and hints into getting beyond it. In fact, a few individual acknowledgements to people that reviewed the work, gave feedback, provided comments, and from all these communities, and resulted in what I'm going to show today. So with that said, I'll just do a very brief introduction on the principles, a summary. Of course, there's a lot more, and then we go and see the models. Let me know if you have any questions around the provenance and pedigree at this point before I jump in. Take that as a no. So, okay, from a methodological perspective, I like to present it as a knowledge-first approach. So rather than trying to start with tools and technologies and software, what we do is literally start from a knowledge elicitation, discussion, empowering the physicians, gathering requirements, understanding, at Mayo we call it how physicians think, to properly identify what is it that is relevant in a broad sense, and in that process apply principles of, we call them knowledge architecting, separation of concerns, distinction, derivation. The goal is to truly understand the mental models, to one, provide cognitive support through these computable artifacts, as needed decision and operational workflow support. At the same time, have modular models that can be packaged, distributed in different configurations, maximizing the trade-off between shareability and portability, and even think about the different ways that the same knowledge content can be delivered by means of operations, delivery operation support that may include translations from one standard into another, may include packaging, may include realization, reification, localization. In other words, try to literally maximize the return on the investment that is the initial, especially when it comes to physician and provider time as me time, get their time to better understand the nature of the model, the content that has to be modeled, and deliver it in a way that can reach the broadest spectrum of adopters and be supporting of the most broad spectrum of technologies. That's why we start with the knowledge, decompose, derive, understand the problem. That informs the choice of modeling languages on one side and modeling patterns on the other side. The languages is a more technical knowledge representation perspective. The patterns is more a domain subject matter oriented perspective. And those two then are brought together into the models. And the emphasis is these models not only have to be faithful, so capture as much as possible, no more, no less, the original intent, but also be fit for purpose. A model that is meant for dissemination of the best practices may not be the same model, even if it may share a lot of the components, of a model used for automation or simulation or optimization, which also speaks to the need of modularizing and assembling all these models into packages, and the idea that there may be alternative variant, different representations or combination of representations of the same knowledge, again, for the very purpose of delivering in the best, most efficient way to the different consumers, whatever and wherever they are. With those principles, this is a framework approach that a few colleagues of mine and I have been working on for years, and is so debatable and so fluid that there's no right or wrong decomposition, but this is a variation on a mental model, mental framework that we apply to decompose the knowledge content of what we call, quote, quote, a guideline or a process model. This is informed by formal knowledge representation perspective with some business aspects. It's a variation on the semantic spectrum or Fox's ladder of intelligent agents. The idea is to separate foundation layers of meaning from layers of reasoning, from layers of action and evaluation and planning. I will not have the time to go into the nuances, but I would like to emphasize that there is a clinical perspective on the spectrum. And this perspective may be a bit more familiar to us, even if maybe not the most agreeable upon. There's definitely a separation between the clinical ontology terminology space. We're used to all the SNOMED and Loink and Eric Snorm of the world. There is the information data model perspective, the quote, quote, HL7 in a sense. There is the rules and calculations and inferences and assessments, including decision support, decision-making from a BPM, BPM Plus perspective. And finally, there is the processes, the process dimension with more imperative versus more adaptive processes. And I did use color schemes appropriately and hint to the fact that this space, the orange, the blue, and the green, is the core focus of BPM as per OMG, but we should not forget that BPM Plus brings in the extra layers that are needed to really go across the spectrum. Because, and I apologize, there's a little bit of a broken animation that emphasizes on CDS should not have happened. Because from this perspective, if we truly look at what is in the ED support tool, we really have a combination of assessment predictive models. Again, this is a scoring tool. We're trying to assess the severity of the patient's COVID case. Some guidelines on what is indicated and what not in terms of testing, care setting, care management setting. There is an implied care process model on how, at what point in reaction to what events should certain actions be taken to further examine the patient or gather necessary information to make the best determinations. And of course, there is foundation clinical concepts. But that's it. That's what is in that tool. Even if that tool is built and implies a few more things, implies the notion of information used to exchange between what is known with the patient, what is known with the EHR, and all the clinical data, labs, observations. What is asked to the patient and the doctor in order to share that common case-related information to make the best determinations and decisions. And as an assessment model of severity, it does have some implications in terms of understanding what is going on with the patient in terms of their disease state and models, as opposed to what should be done to the patient in the clinic. So second tier, implicit information content in the tool. And a third tier, which is if we truly wanted to implement in some setting, to bind that model to a specific implementation, then we probably would need information exchange, codified data, and maybe even a way to deliver that care, track the workflow, document the workflow, and possibly assess the quality, so how the process has been flowing. I see a couple of comments around provenance, pedigree, and packaging. Yes, I did not call it out explicitly. I will expand on that. It's not core to today, but Steve, yes, good point. Now, with that in mind, the reason why I brought this up is that the models we'll be looking at today are mostly focused on the core that is in the tool. So guidelines, assessments, and predictions with a overarching process orchestration and the support for clinical concepts. The next tiers are things that can be derived, can be bound, can be added to a broader package that will be needed for delivery. But that's the space where variations on the delivery will be branching out to a set of alternative variants that could be used. That's why I focus on the core, which will be common to all of them. And before we jump into the models, one last perspective, which is if we now try to actually do the modeling based on decomposition, what are the options? What do we have in OMG land, so to speak, the top part of the slide? And what would or do we have in our twin counterpart in HL7 Fireland? I know the mapping is not perfect and debatable, but just to give an idea that there are strong parallelisms and gaps and opportunities, which are the ones that drove not only the choice of modeling for me today. So as we were focusing on assessments and cases, what I'm going to show today will be CMMN and DMN models mostly, with a touch of implicit ontology. So for one, I will not be showing, or I will be showing why I did not do a BPM model. And also calling out the fact that in the broader collaboration effort, the case and decision and implicitly process models and ontologies are part of a family of complementary alternative supplementing artifacts that are include a mixture of human readable content, BPM plus, semantic web, HL7 Fire, richer environment. But I will leave that conversation for another venue because I'd like to spend most of the time on the core BPM Plus models today. With that said, any questions on some? I've seen a couple popping up. Tracy, would you mind orchestrating some of the questions before we move on?
Yeah, sure. So you're going to address the question about provenance and pedigree later on, I think you mentioned. Yep. And then there's a question about if the slides will be available to download later. Yep. Okay, great. So we'll
absolutely.
And then question just came in. Do you know of any enterprise integrated data platform products that do a good job of storing, sharing, and applying these various knowledge assets to analytic products?
So products, I don't know, and I wouldn't want to know because I'm not necessarily calling out different products. I know that there are initiatives to collect these assets and the corresponding artifacts into packages that should be made available through a variety of repository quote implementations. I am on a different initiative at OMG that is working on APIs to standardize the interaction with those repositories, which may include just repositories and or authoring environments that can also play the role of repositories. And I would also say that some platforms may be exposing this knowledge content as data. I'm thinking FHIR here. So especially when it comes to the FHIR-based representation of this knowledge, it could be served through FHIR APIs. But that said, I would prefer not to call out any quote named products, even if we can discuss offline some of the experiences I had.
And then the last question that came in, what does questionnaire represent? Observations, conditions, or other FHIR resources?
I was calling out the actual FHIR questionnaire resource per se, so and equivalent, so model-driven form specification that defines what kind of data elements need to be collected. So I know there was a LONC-related effort, LONC forms, I think, to be in the same space, but the questionnaire is the shell, so to speak. The answers to the questionnaire then get manifested and persisted as, or can be used to derive and persist observations, conditions, and other elemental record fragments with governance and a lot of processes that are probably out of scope for today.
He says, thank you, great answer. Okay, that's it for questions.
Yeah, the whole how to go from a questionnaire response to enriching officially the medical record is there's patient safety and provenance. That's actually a case for provenance and pedigree. But anyway, so model review. I will try to shift to the actual models and see if that works. So taking a quick look at the human readable artifact first. In terms of decompositions, this is a bidimensional sort of asset. We see there is a classification model that stratifies the patients. Of course, there is inclusion and exclusion criteria like any good situated support artifact. But then the core element is the stratification of the risk factors using multiple alternative criteria. So vital signs versus a scoring model versus symptoms versus diagnostic and imaging different criteria that concur and need to be reconciled to classify the patient. There's some loose orchestration sequencing. There's like a vertical direction. Certain things should be done, be done first. And in between, this is interleaved with some indications. So not necessarily a recommendation per se, but this tool is not telling what to do, but more like how strongly or not, based on evidence, certain things are indicated. So with that in mind, that distinction helps us, at a minimum, identify a few problems. One is that there are if-then kind of assessments based on the vitals and the labs. The patient risk of devolving is high, for example, or not. There's actually 5 categories. And implicitly, that is based on assessment of how severe the patient's COVID disease process is at the point. And that's what drives to, based on the severity and the progression with the disease, how likely it is that the patient will transition into a worse state of the disease that may require more, let's say, aggressive interventions, for lack of a better term. So trying to make these assessments, and this is part of the methodology, two-step process: facts, inference of state, from which we can make better predictions. And the combination of state and prediction minus what people call the exclusion criteria, or the quote-unquote defeaters, leads to determining the indication, which is based on where the patient is and comparing that to where the patient should be. Of course, for COVID, should be healthy patient, able to breathe normally again and not have any, symptom and signs. What would be the possible strategies to go from the current state to the goal? In other words, what are the options for taking care of the patients? And those indications then can lead to recommendations, because A, B, and C are indicated and A is more strongly indicated, then A should be recommended. So doctor, please consider do A. But that last part I just called out is not in the tool. So decision support is derivable from the tool, but is not in the tool. So the models I did stop before decision support. We're not going to see recommendation rules today. We're going to see inferences. And of the two kinds, assessments of state versus assessments of indication. And the second thing is, what's the sequencing here? Are we literally going in a linear fashion vertically? Or is this a priority that is, for lack of better terms, so a better context, a prior priority? In an ideal state, in a happy path way, you should go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But the reality is, and this was confirmed with me, this is an ED. This is a dynamic environment where all kinds of informations come in at different times. And especially when labs and tests are scheduled, the workflow can be disrupted at any moment. The situation evolves. There has to be a more reactive approach than a sequencing linear. This is what you have to do in order to properly take care of the patient. And even most importantly, absolutely, the level of detail at where this tool stops is, we're not looking anywhere in here at describing the actual clinical workflow. there's no EHR interaction. There's no, and by workflow I meant order set versus execution of the order versus documentation. The EHR is not implied. This could be done and delivered to somebody that doesn't even have a computer. So how can we create models that, back to the faithfulness of the model, just capture this, can be extended and complemented with the next tiers of detail, but do not need to embed that upfront, because that would create essentially an overfitting. In fact, when we took this model, we did try, mostly as an academic exercise, to create a workflow model, like I would call this personally a pathway, a happy pathway, a process that describes the ideal sequencing, which is happening probably 20% of the times because of all the event-based disruptions. So yeah, we should, in theory, intake the patient, confirm that they have COVID. If not, test them. Once they're confirmed, assess the patient, deliberate whether they are good enough to go home or they need more testing, and then do the actual fully informed diagnostic assessment and send them to the ICU versus the clinic versus no, they're good to go home. But this process, even if it doesn't go into the workflow, there's no EHR documentation here. There's no explicit order, test, collect the data, measure, interpret the result here. All of that, if anything, would be in a sub-process or a sub-task. We abandoned the idea of doing it this way early on because, again, under the principle of faithfulness, trying to create a model that captures the gist of the intent of this tool, which is one possible reasons for modeling. So not describing what happens in a clinic, not simulating, not automating, trying to capture the intent of this as a cognitive support tool mixed with flexible guidelines. What that led us to do is a CMMN model, a case model that tries as much as possible to accommodate for how the emergency doctor physician would deal with the patient as they show up. Methodology principles, choice of modeling tools. In the field guide, the balance between the BPMN versus CMMN arms of the scales. This is a case, especially because this is an emergency department with a very fluid environment. Reactive, event-oriented approach is, again, more faithful to what the intent of that paper pamphlet was. So we definitely went for CMMN because this is a case where not only the particular problem mandates it, it also facilitates more flexibility, I guess, aims or results in more portability. So something that is more easily shareable and reusable directly. And with that in mind, the second step was how do we capture, how do we interpret the actual interactions between the different stages of the decisions, mostly the assessments, the predictions, the indications that are made, that are implied in the tool between each other without over-imposing a workflow. The principle has basically been, as always, extrapolate, separate the decisions. So any inference, any assessment, any estimation, any indication, pull them out, make them decision models. encapsulate the decision models in decision tasks, like assess the patient based on clinical evidence, decide what to do with the patient based on that initial assessment, reassess the patient more in depth, also taking into account the diagnostic evidence, and then make the final decision, the final disposition about what is the most indicated strategy for taking care of the patient without actually telling the doctor where to send the patient, because the actual act of taking all the recommendations of the machine and the availability of resource and the situation and the environment and is something that can even hardly be captured by a decision model, or if it was, it would not be an automatable decision model. As soon as the decisions are separated and properly encapsulated, the question left is, how are these things orchestrated? Is there sequencing? Is there reactivity? And the only way to do it, or at least the way I found successfully to do it, is talking to the physicians, to the subject matter experts, asking what scenarios are possible. Of course, not only desirable, but what can happen and how can we capture those scenarios in the model. And my other take on this is to confirm that we capture them correctly, not only model them, but try to put on the perspective of the consumer and ask the consumer, from what you consumer did read in the model, are you able to support these scenarios I'm telling you about? I don't have much, well, I do have some of an interpreter of this model, which is a computer, which is intelligent and dumb enough to be fully and completely able to literally speak to, what did I tell it? And let me see, okay, I need to get the presentation part off. So what is this model actually looking at? It's looking at the fact that there is an event, which is the patient admission. Patient shows up, and we know that this whole ED model only applies, is valid for adult with COVID. So we definitely want to apply some inclusion criteria early on, and if the inclusion does not apply, this whole model should be silenced and be done. But let's say that it does apply. So we have an adult with COVID. There are exclusion criteria. There are things that are so immediately evident that if they are the case, we don't even bother. The patient comes in on a barely conscious, on a ventilator, and in critical conditions. None of this matters. We just send them where they belong. Case is closed. However, in more reasonable situations, a patient shows in and the physician may just want to do an assessment, assess them, and based on what is looking, maybe there is enough information to actually do the initial disposition. This patient is healthy, they can go home. Or no, it's evident they need more workup, so let's send them, well, next to a diagnostic workup. I'll come to that in a moment. Because what maybe truly has to happen is there's not much known about the patient, so maybe we need to confirm that they have COVID. Maybe we need to take a look at the patient, take a deeper look, and anytime enough information comes back, we can make the assessment. And maybe we make the assessment and we're not yet convinced, something's still missing, so let's wait a little bit more. More information comes back, and based on the revised information, we make the assessment again. And maybe the doctor wants to do something else and re-examine the patient. And based on what they got, which does not result in data, they touch, look, feel the patient in a good way, obviously. That's now the time when the doctor will be able and want to make the assessment, finally. And now they have information on what to do. The simulation requires me to actually complete all of these. That's a little fix. So now we know whether or not the patient can go home and we discharge them, or if the patient needs more work. Most likely there will be diagnostic testing involved, however many times. And yeah, as that information comes in, we perform the diagnostic assessment, which is a classification of the patient severity based on labs, imaging, and other more thorough examinations. Still acknowledging the fact that there may be news on the clinical side. So maybe the patient manifests some worsening of their vitals or manifests a symptom. So in this case, even if we move to a different stage, a stage where the patient is now in the ED, is being worked on with imaging and labs and stuff, we're still able to revisit the whole assessment decision on the more clinical side. And either way, all the information I'll show in the decision model flows into the final disposition, which is its completion when completed is basically the point where the physician knows, okay, we know enough. This patient needs to go to the ICU. No, this patient, barely, but can go home, or take them to the ward. And that's the moment to finally trigger the process of closing the case. Event-drivenness, reactivity, out-of-order execution to better react to an environment where a lot of things can happen in a variety of scenarios. The principle of staying abstract still applies. A lot of these tasks here are listed as human or essentially human. They could be actually modeled better as sub-processes or sub-cases, with the idea that they would be bound at distribution time so that we can plug in the actual process for doing the tests. But the whole idea of hierarchical white box versus black box is unchanged. So with that in mind, then what we can do is look into the actual decisions. And the idea is this orchestration is meant to take care of the processes of gathering data to feed to the decisions, and also consuming the outcome of the decisions as they actually result in an update to the substrate that the case is working on, which triggers the possibility, not the mandate, of reassessing the patient essentially, until again we finalize the case. So the decisions now actually are more, I would say, traditional in a sense. Even if we can see a few patterns still here. So the idea of the multi-criteria assessment, trying to determine the severity of the patient's COVID case from the QCSI score, a quick index based on a few very simple aspects like the respiratory rate, if the patient is on an oxygen supplement, how much they're getting, and their oxygen saturation. In parallel, looking at vitals, specifically blood pressure and heart rate, but however many others. Oops, by the way, I'm looking at the wrong models. Well, very similar. Another couple of criteria, this time based on symptoms that the patient may have versus risk or exacerbating factors. Can also be different angles to, or different perspectives from which the patient can be classified. Another angle often overlooked, which is the social determinants and risk factors. So things that go outside and beyond the purely clinical and medical aspects. In this case, we had the long-term care resident as an example. And finally, this notion of bringing things together. So reconciling all the different perspectives into a conflict resolution strategy, mainly based on priorities. So what is the worst classification based on all the criteria? And introducing the notion of defeater, which is in clinical, the exclusion criteria, which pretty much, no matter what the classification would be, if there is a quote, defeater criteria, that sets the determination to pretty much to a fixed value. Defeater as in defeasible logic, but also defeater as in defeats the purpose of performing the whole evaluation here. So these are assessment models because they take what is known about the patient and derive insights into the patient. And these are the ones used in the next step to actually determine now what is indicated or not for the patient. So we can see the key element here is that classification, and then a lot more context state identification aspects that essentially help determine, now that we know how bad the patient is and we know where they are, these side decisions help us get more information about where the patient is in terms of the general clinical state, not only the clinical state or medical state as per COVID, but also where the patient should be. So more context that builds into the more strategic rule that rather than trying to say where the patient stands, is more a suggestion on where the patient could go, and by could go, I mean figuratively, in terms of what are the possible next steps to take care of the patients, evidence-based, guideline-based, without actually trying to enforce any of that to happen, besides communicating the strength of recommendation and the strength of evidence. So this pattern has been applied in the initial stage, the clinical, and then very much in a similar fashion in the second stage, which is the diagnostic. So more of the same, we got a classification of the patient based on some additional imaging and labs, and then, well, labs and some more imaging tests, which results in a reconciliation of the patient severity and the final diagnostic disposition, which takes into account both the diagnostic disposition, strictly speaking, combined with the clinical assessment to reconcile them into a fully, this is, to the best of our knowledge and evidence, how severe the patient is. And all of that builds into another indication for this time for what is the best setting to take care of the patient. One last thing to complete the final pattern, the notion of how do we bind the information to the decision models and ultimately the case models. I've started to apply the situational data modeling principle. So each of these decisions builds on information that can be ultimately ascribed to a clinical concept. So things that can and actually are modeled in clinical ontologies, specifically with SNOMED post-coordination. That's a detail. And verbalized as has RV enlargement or value of current troponin. Those clinical concepts or model elements that are semantically bound to clinical concepts, the semantic BPM plus we as a team have been advocating. They're also tied to data, which is also bound semantically. And it's situational data because the schemas associated to, oops, I did not want to do that. The schemas associated to these inputs are meant to do two things. One is to cast data that usually comes from EHR, data sources, questionnaires, into a normalized form. And on top of that, a form that is semantically normalized. And what I mean by that is, for example, on the clinical features here. So we know that, first and foremost, when it comes to the case of COVID for what it matters to this set of assessments, there are all and only certain things that matter, certain vitals, certain labs, certain conditions. And not only that, we're not just interested in systolic blood pressures. Okay, we can get those readings from the EHR, from a device, from smartphone, wherever. But the role correlation between that data and the case is by virtue of the blood pressure value I'm looking at is the current, the most recent, the recently documented blood pressure measurement. Or when it comes to conditions, am I looking at a condition that the patient has, a condition that the patient has but well or not well managed, a condition a patient is at risk of? So the situational data modeling that we do as part of the package serves those multiple roles: semantic binding, normalization of the data sources, and proper binding to the data sources, and essentially creates that trade union between the world of clinical data and EHRs as needed, and the model space in a way that is safe, secure, and also makes it conveniently accessible. And with that said, I will stop because we are 5 minutes, I'm assuming, into the deadline, the end of time, so I'll let it open for more questions.
Yeah, so question came in, how would this model present to a clinical user in a real world scenario? And then a follow-up from another participant, how can this model integrate with the real world, with existing systems, et cetera?
Yep. So I guess we're looking at if this was a three-tier architecture, one is what is the model to data sort of interaction, and the other is what is the model to presentation interaction sort of integration. On the data side, we need binding layers. My argument is we need binding layers anyway, even if we have things like FHIR that provide federated abstract access to the data. Because at a minimum, we know that at some point we need semantic normalization of the FHIR data, validation, the application of profiles. If, and I would argue, as we do that, because we need to do that, then it's one tiny step further to take the validated FHIR data and cast it into these quote logical models. And there are several ways to do it. In our OMG space, we have MDMI, which is a standard for doing, well, exactly that. Pure FHIR-based architectures would use CQL layers to do that, retrieve, select, cast transformations. That could be, of course, you can put any of these behind an API. So you can hide with things like CDS hooks, this extra tier. There are several ways to do it. My argument is it is needed because raw data from FHIR interfaces, for a variety of reasons, most of the times would not be suitable semantically and clinically to be used as is without some control. And secondarily, FHIR data is not as suitable for processing. It's great for interchange, but definitely needs some manipulation to be used effectively in a reasoning environment. Moving to the other side, these are models. So you need an engine and an application stack to consume these models and drive, I can't say an application, variety of applications. You could use the CMMN and BPMN models as process models in a process engine. What that would do typically is create tasks, orchestrate, schedule them, assign them, or allow people to grab and execute them. There are interactions. We mentioned questionnaires. You can derive a questionnaire and bind it to a decision model as a data entry form and provide the data for the decision to it. That's one option. In our work at Mayo, we're doing something like even taking the model and use the model structure to drive the layout of a user interface. So a dynamic application that is configured by essentially the process model and lets you navigate through the tasks, not as a list, but more as a network. And then actual decisions, we have that, again, questionnaire bound to data and open to use as kind of integration. I guess in general, there's not one architectural way, there are several.
Mm-hmm. And Andy and Simone, feel free if you want to come off mute, you're welcome to. And if there are any other questions, looks like we addressed them all from the chat box. So
let me add that the slides and the models will be published, and we're working to find a proper place that gives the proper openness without ownership of some kind. So we should have that done shortly. But yeah, all these models will be open and available.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. And we took a recording of this session, and Davide is letting us share the slides as well, so we'll be posting those. The next workshop session starts in about 15 minutes. It's with Dr. Frank Opelka, American College of Surgeons, curating clinical knowledge in the age of AI and machine learning. So we'll see you on there in about 15. And thanks again, Davide, and everyone that's on today.
I see a last question.
Yeah.
Simona, are you still on?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I was not talking.
Yep.
Just not to everybody.
No worries. So the COVID-19 Digital Guideline Teams initiative is actually looking into building applications out of these models. And applications, as I mentioned, there's a whole set of teams that include application developers. We're looking for funding or donations to get that started. So some work has been started in terms of at least simulating the models with simulated patients. It's not been done yet, but it is on the roadmap.
And sorry, I insist. Would it be nice to understand? I know this is not the right situation to understand which software have been selected for this real implementation. As I'm particularly interested in evaluating, and I work in Baxter, and I'm evaluating how to implement the clinical pathways in real world. So, is it possible to have a session somehow in these days to talk privately about this?
Yeah, so there's an implementation work group in BPM Plus, and if you're interested specifically to these models in the COVID-19, contact me. I'll refer you to that broader initiative. I can tell you how the same principles have been applied at Mayo, because we have applications that use the BPM Plus and similar approaches with completely different use cases. So that's also a possibility.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. My email is in the slides, and we'll be sharing all the content.
All right. Thank you. Everyone have a nice afternoon, and we'll see you soon.
Bye all. Thank you.